Hello my dear friends, how are you? Welcome, thank you for joining me here. I'm Mari Theriger and today I would like to talk a little bit about folk horror and werewolves. Proper werewolves, you know. As you might imagine, I'm not a big fan of Twilight, so I'm certainly not Team Jacob, nor am I Team Edward. I'm Team Bella. She can take care of herself. She doesn't need non-sweat dogs and sad sparkling dicks. Well, if like myself you are a fan of Robert Eggers' cinematographic works, there's a great news, right? He's working on his next film called Werewolf. So I reckon we are about to see another werewolf movie, and probably one of those that will belong to the list of the top 10 werewolf movies. I'm not here to develop on why I'm a big fan of Eggers' works. I would just like to briefly address the subject of werewolves because, you see, one of the things that always surprises me about Robert Eggers' movies is the attention to the details from historical records, folklore, archaeological evidences, and so on and so forth. I was greatly impressed by one of his movies, The Northman, from which I have done a video in the past pointing out the historical details and evidences and what is true to the knowledge we really have on late Iron Age Scandinavian society and medieval Europe at the time. So I would like to start this video by addressing the folk horror genre. And then let's jump to a brief take on werewolves. As I said, I'm not going to cover in great detail about werewolves because some secrets have to be kept. Well then, folk horror as a fictional subgenre has been quite captivating in recent decades, and I think it's only getting more so. One of the things that absolutely fascinates me most is the ability of some filmmakers to capture a certain primordial fear, seeking themes that touch on ancient human fears, especially about the unknown in nature. This feeling is actually quite medieval when in Europe, most especially in Europe, there's a greater distinction a greater distinction began to be made between human space and wild space, creating all sorts of new fears, and this only enriched folklore later on, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, when Europe, with industrialization and new ways of life that uprooted people from their rural traditions, created new fears and an even greater distance from the natural and rural world. So folk horror, for me, is especially interesting for its philosophical and psychological aspects, which lead us to question human nature and society. I especially like this subgenre of horror, not only because I'm a big fan of horror and an absolute fan of dark and mystical atmospheres in literature, music, and films, but also because Western society, in our Western society, in the past 100 years or so, it has experienced a great romanticism towards rural spaces and nature, mostly due to political issues which have generated a lot of misinformation and a detachment from reality, leading people to take refuge in a permanent escapism. Folk horror, when done well, of course, truly reminds us that not everything is a bed of roses, which encourages us to once again create a sense of respect for nature and face reality, which at the same time helps us to be more grateful for the innovations that help us live better instead of focusing on an idyllic time that never happened and remaining in this fantasy and forgetting to live in reality. But that is perhaps a subject for another time. Well, the term folk horror was first used to characterize a subgenre in the 1970s and has been present in pop culture in a quite noticeable way in recent times as a revival. It was used for the first time by Rod Cooper to describe the movie The Blood on Satan's Claw from 1971, a movie by Piers Haggard. Folk horror, of course, is a subgenre of horror, although this is open to criticism, but it typically draws on narrative elements that revolve around a rural or idyllic human community, a place where people live in perfect harmony with nature. Of course, folk horror has expanded into other facets more recently, but the origins of this subgenre have always been a focus on this fantastical romanticism that actually began in Europe in the late 19th century. Folk horror thus ends up being a critical response to this romanticism, revealing the horrors hidden behind the farces. In folk horror, this same harmonious relationship is precisely balanced by ritualistic, often bloody, sacrificial acts. This part has more to do with the new fears that emerged in the United States in the 1970s with the emergence of Satanism as a religious philosophical movement critical of traditional Christian religions, which I've already mentioned. I've already talked about this in the previous video, so no point in getting into more details and repeat what was already said. If you want, watch that video down below in the description. However, the fear of the unknown, stigma and ignorance led to a strong emphasis on human sacrifice in works of cinematic fiction from the 70s onwards. This is clearly seen when folk horror emerged, which was by this time, with its exaggeration and caricature of what was experienced in the 1970s in the United States. More recent folk horror by non-US filmmakers, but not all, or by, let's say, by filmmakers who want to focus more on the paranormal aspects of folklore and not so much on the fears of modern society in the US, usually try to distance themselves from human sacrifice, exchanging it for other elements that continue to emphasize this destruction of post-industrial romanticism. In any case, in the origins of folk horror, the main character, when faced with this abrupt tearing of an idyllic fantasy, is faced with the reality of sacrifice, blood, and death. Behind so much abundance and apparently harmony of the community, the human community, these bizarre and morally incomprehensible elements for the outsider, fear and terror dominate the character, who most of the time ends up being sacrificed himself, right? You see, the earth and nature are what connects us to other animals, and it is these elements that ultimately awaken these more ancestral and primitive facets, which create in these narratives a feeling of dread. This is one of the reasons I appreciate folk horror, especially for me, even in terms of New Age spirituality, because Western society has been romanticizing nature so much that, in fact, New Age religions, even or mostly in neo-paganism, neo-druidic and neo-shamanic movements, profess harmony with nature and its importance, right? However, the discourse has been extremely vague and shallow, and there isn't really a clear and genuine respect for nature. There's a great romanticism about nature, but not a true focus on the brutal reality of the natural world that humbles us and leads us to truly respect natural spaces and be more mindful of our impact on it. In new spiritualities, this human egocentrism has continued to exist, placing oneself at the center of the spiritual, channeling the romanticized harmony in nature, instead of a vision that the human being is inserted in the natural world and that the natural world does not actually need the human being to live, survive, and develop, but rather the human being conducts its spirituality as a mechanism of beneficial interaction, not only as a way of survival, but also to integrate itself more into the natural and not this individualism of new age religions and spirituality in which everyone competes with each other to be able to make more money with their spiritual performances. But anyway, folk horror captures the human element as a fragile and very much powerless being against the brutality of nature and the brutality of modes of survival when inserted within the natural. And this, combined with isolation and distance from so-called civilization, leads the character to live in a context of terrifying dehumanization, a rejection of social norms, moral values, and hegemonic religious conventions. Faced with the harsh reality of the natural world, which cares nothing for human values, morals, and beliefs, nor needs them, right? So folk horror ultimately reminds us that nature always finds a way to end human arrogance, and at any moment we realize that, as I said before, the natural world needs humans for nothing and in fact triumphs more quickly without them. Mind you that this doesn't mean that we humans are unnecessary in the ecosystem. At least in my view, as we see in animist beliefs, it demonstrates that humans need to understand their true place in the cycle of life and the dynamics of nature to better its own existence and find meaningful joy and pleasure. And folk horror expresses the brutality of nature precisely in what humans fear the most: other humans. Realizing that another from the same species cannot be reasoned with, can't succumb to being bargained with, because it doesn't follow our beliefs, doesn't share your morals. It's truly frightening. It's the same as facing nature itself, but in human form. It's not a question of lack of morals or going against the morals, because that would require an understanding or recognition of morals and, as such, denying or refusing them. No, it's not a conscious existence prone to evil. It's an amoral existence which thrives on flowing with the cycles, where life and death do not succumb to morals but to a non-existing perception of what truly means to be alive or dead, and where it lies the tenuous division between good and evil, but simply an ever-flowing cyclical existence where everything has its place and purpose in the grand scheme of perpetual recycling of life. I didn't want to go philosophical on this, but well, here we are. Nationalist romanticism of the 19th and early 20th centuries, for political reasons and as a means for many European nations to find an ancestral identity, did not limit itself to philosophy, religion, and spirituality, but also opened doors to historical fiction. Indeed, this was largely the focus of nationalist romanticism. I've mentioned authors like Margaret Murray and her extensive study of witchcraft and witches in a past video, creating historical fiction, in other words, a history that never existed, as well as James Fraser and his The Golden Bough. I've also briefly mentioned his work in those same past videos. So, inspired by such studies, which created historical fiction, several writers began to explore the supposed survivals of so-called pagan societal traditions in an even more fictionalized form. Of course, distorted views on the history of ancient society, especially since some academic figures whose work has now been completely debunked and dismissed, such as I said, Margaret Murray's studies on witchcraft, among others. There were many, not just her, of course, but these academic figures of the time have helped to further create fantasies about these subjects and about so-called pagan societies, which has led to works of fiction that further exaggerate beliefs in human sacrifice and destructive magic and curses and whatnot. Even some works of cosmic horror can simultaneously be folk horror as well, when the narratives feature plots of sacrifices to deities that reveal the nuance of humanity's tiny and even despicable existence in the face of the cosmos. For this very reason, paganism is often the background of folk horror, when in fact this paganism is often romanticism of the past based on whimsical wishes and not on science, as well as fears drawn from post-industrial European folklore. And one of the great reasons I do enjoy Robert Ager's works, when his works are more focused on historical folklore, such is the case of the movie The Witch or The Witch, it's because there's a focus on the historical elements of the folk tales, mainly how the folk elements he explores have been expressed and explained in documented evidences of the past. So this is where this subject leads me to talk about werewolves. Just a brief take, if you please. If you haven't read this book yet, I highly recommend it. It's an impressive account of the now famous Livonian werewolf, and someday on my experimental solo music project, Varum, I would like to make an album solely for the werewolf siblings, and I would like to include a track for this particular account. I'm not going to spoil it for you. I really hope you can get your hands on this one. It's quite good indeed. Let's give a general overview of this topic. Lycanthropy is the total or partial transformation of a human being into a wolf or wolf form, and can be accomplished in a variety of ways. Or so we are told by the tales and documentation that have survived to this day. One of the most frequently cited studies of lycanthropy is the folklore studies of Sabine Baring-Gould, which resulted in the book of Werewolves, 1865, where we can read about countless possibilities for becoming a beast, from belts to enchanted springs, animal skins, curses, pacts, and many other ways to become a werewolf. The poet Ovid also leaves us with some accounts in his work Metamorphoses, speaking in part about lycanthropy, a subject that, as we see by this account, already dates back to classical antiquity, when gods and humans coexisted on Earth. So upon learning of the murders committed by Lycaon, king of Arcadia, the god Jupiter disguised himself as a wanderer and visited the king, who invited him to dinner. During the meal, Lycaon, suspicious of his guest's identity, served him human flesh. Jupiter became furious when he discovered the accusations were true and condemned King Lycaon to live as a wolf. Lycanthropy, according to classical authors, supposedly began here. I mean, this relationship between the divine, especially a deity who disguises himself as a wanderer and imposes a curse to turn a man into a wolf, is quite curious. But not just any man, you see, but a criminal. We see this parallel in late Iron Age and early medieval Scandinavia, in tales that tell of werewolves, or at least men who behave like wolves and also don wolf skins and become the animal. Parallels here which appear to be a cult, a brotherhood of sorts, possibly linked to the god Odin, a deity famous for also disguising himself as a wanderer and roaming the world, deceiving but also testing those he crosses paths with. Many of these werewolves from the, let's say, Nordic cultural world, especially from the Middle Ages and especially in Icelandic literary sources, were not only warriors. In fact, the warrior cases are quite specific, and we see more of a wolf cult, possibly, instead of someone becoming a wolf. But also, and mostly, these people were outcasts, criminals, whose penalty was exclusion and banishment from the human community, roaming the wilds, subject to be captured and of being killed by anyone who chose to hunt them. Many of the literary sources tell us that these criminals, in the Nordic world of course, expelled from the community, were called vargar, wolves, and as such could be hunted and killed, as was done with wolves. But regarding werewolves and all these topics from Scandinavia and other Nordic geographical realities, I already have a few videos on this topic somewhere on this channel. There are many werewolves in many cultures, and we can see how each society, in certain places and historical moments, produced its own werewolf version, often different versions in the same cultural realities. So let's move on. Metamorphosis from certain elements was very common, ranging from pelts, skins, drinking water from footprints, bathing in springs, being one of 7 children in a family or the 7th child, ointments and witchcraft, among other ways to become a werewolf. There's plenty to choose from. Folklore is varied, right? I don't know how Robert Eggers will justify the existence of the werewolf in his next film, but it's probably always best to leave that part a mystery. There's actually an interesting form of transformation for those who wish to become werewolves. Going into a forest at night, of course, finding a fallen tree, stabbing the tree with a copper knife, while walking around the trunk and repeating aloud the incantation I'll show you here on the screen. I took a photo of this part in the book for you to read it and perhaps try it later on in the forest. This type of incantation, a spell actually, is interesting. Similar spells with these structures appear frequently in traditional folk magic. But well, after reciting the incantation, it's necessary to jump 3 times from one side of the tree to the other and then run through the forest. The transformation will occur during the run. After transformation, a werewolf is never completely safe. It's possible to recognize or be recognized if you are a lycanthrope. Recognize a werewolf in its wolf or human form. Because not everything is as it seems, and more often than not, what appears to be the most common human being is often more than what appears to be. According to Baring-Gould, the author I've mentioned previously, despite the uncertainties of distinguishing a werewolf, there is a way to visually determine whether we are dealing with a natural animal or transformed humans. Just pay attention to the being's tails, right? As these transformations are never complete. Therefore, animals with deficient tails are actually persons who have somehow received the power to transform into a wolf. This actually reminds me of a variety of spirits, mostly the yokai, in Japanese animism, because in animal or human form, there's almost always a mismatch in the body shape, thus revealing the identity of a transformed spirit. The same is also noted in some Native American belief systems and in mythology and folklore, which is quite interesting. Anyway, returning to animal form, in addition to what I've already said, wolves end up acquiring some human characteristics, in addition to the size differences to those of natural wolves, of course. There's an interesting case of Jean Granier, a child who lived in Landais, France, and during the 16th century claimed to transform into a wolf and attack children. Those who witnessed the attacks claimed to have seen an animal that resembled a wolf, but shorter and fatter. Its fur was red, its tail short, and its head smaller than that of a normal wolf. The wolf's fur was the same color as the child's hair, and its tail and size differed from those of normal wolves. Meanwhile, there are also ways to encounter a lycanthrope without being in wolf form. According to the French physician Jean de Nagneau, in his treatise de la Lycanthropy, Transformation et Extase des Sorciers, 1615, we find the description of the individual who transforms into a wolf, mentioning that they are pale and have sunken eyes, and that they see only dimly as if surrounded by darkness. They have a dry tongue and are thirsty all the time with no saliva in their mouth. They also have injured leg bones, as they often bump with them, and are beaten there by dogs, which are wounds difficult to heal. So basically a ghostly pale a person who needs glasses and has worked in a kennel during the summer. Usually in movies about werewolves, we rarely see them with a companion, a partner, or wherever. It's true that in many tales and accounts, folk tales, werewolves attacked or worked alone. I say worked because not all werewolf stories are about people who turn into beasts and lose all control and start attacking people. Many accounts, or some accounts, quite a few, tell us of people who are aware of their power of metamorphosis or even shapeshifting and use this power or curse or gift to help the community. Such is the case in the book I've mentioned previously, earlier on in this video, about the Livonian werewolf. No spoilers. Well, solitary or accompanied, what do the sources in folklore tell us about the lives of these beings? As you might imagine, the accounts in the sources vary quite a lot, of course. In some cases, werewolves attack alone. In others, they have werewolf partners or are accompanied by other individuals, such as family members. Well, in the treatise de la Démonomanie des Sorciers, 1587, by the jurist Jean Baudin, we find the companions Pierre Bourgault and Michel Verdun, men who confessed in 1521 to having renounced God and served the devil, who had given them the power to transform into a wolf. These beast-like individuals in this account attacked and killed children and young people, and admitted during their trial that they had copulated with she-wolves. In another example, also cited by Jean Baudin, we find Gilles Garnier, who in 1574 was tried in the form of a wolf, of course, killing and eating several children. According to these sources, the accused also took the victims' bodies home to feed himself and his family. Therefore, both Granier and his wife and children were sentenced to death by burning. Of these two cases I've mentioned here, the first seems more like a case of psychosis and torture, confessing what the authorities wanted to hear to make an example of these psychotic murderers. A bit like the US Supreme Court asking all those nonsensical questions to the CEO of TikTok, always hoping and forcing him to admit he was Chinese even though he isn't. No one is leaving this court until someone is Chinese, goddammit. The latter case seems to be a case of extreme poverty and desperation due to hunger, famine, a family that starved and turned to cannibalism, very common in many societies throughout history when famine is installed. We are talking about 16th century France, a period in France's history filled with religious conflict, economic hardship and political instability. High taxes, inflation and poverty were exacerbated and people were starving. However, werewolves can act alone, as in the case presented in the work Maleus Maleficarum 1487, in which a man believed he could transform into a wolf and therefore hid in caves. The man claimed to come out at night and attack and devour countless children. Again, this memo. The authors mentioned in these examples viewed these accounts differently, of course. So while Jean Baudin defended the veracity of the confessions and the transformation into a wolf, others pointed out that the transformation presented, for instance, in the latter account, in the Maleus Maleficarum, did not occur at all in reality, but merely in illusion, in dreams, wherever. There were many reports of attacks, and within them the positions of the werewolves varied, as did the perceptions of others regarding the events. Furthermore, whether alone or accompanied, werewolves were most often accused of murdering, mainly murdering children and feeding on human flesh. That's why I ask you to read the Livonian werewolf account, because it's quite different from the werewolf stories we usually read, with surprising motives completely opposite to what we are used to reading. Perhaps Robert Eggers will choose to present a werewolf closer to what we are more accustomed to, but if it were about the Livonian werewolf case, or in other words, about Thies of Keltenboon, that would be amazing. Well, I've mentioned a few examples here, and mainly in France, werewolves were often executed, right? Brutal executions for werewolves, or those who believed they were werewolves, including torture, imprisonment, burning at the stake, etc. Therefore, as we have seen, cases of lycanthropy were typically associated with violent acts involving deaths and persecutions, right? Persecutions. Therefore, the treatment of these individuals involved hunts, torture, imprisonment, and death sentences. There's a good example in 1542. Hiob Fensel recounts that there were so many werewolves in Constantinople that the emperor, accompanied by his guard, left the city to severely punish them and kill hundreds of them. Perhaps this reminds you of what I also talked about in a video about the Berserkir and Hulfednar, more specifically the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of the Byzantine army from the 10th to the 14th century, who served as personal bodyguards to the Byzantine emperors, primarily composed of recruits from Northern Europe, including mainly Norsemen from Scandinavia, but also Anglo-Saxons from England. And there are reports of some of their own celebrations in which they dressed in animal pelts. There is this possible interpretation of dressing in wolf skins and conducting their celebrations dressed as such outside of the city. This is a subject that I've talked about in that previous video, so in the description of this video, check if you have the time, of course. But Hiob Finsel's account is from the 16th century, right? It could be an account not of his own time, but from a previous period reporting to perhaps the late 14th century or early 15th century, perhaps the emperor of the time wanting to get rid of the former Varangian Guard. And so this is an account of murdering werewolves to serve as an example and getting rid of the involvement of Northern European recruits, conscripts. I mean, Constantinople was captured by the Ottoman Empire in the mid-15th century. So it wouldn't be surprising that even though the Varangian Guard had, of course, come to an end a century prior to this event, perhaps these former soldiers were still active in some other way, perhaps administratively. But I'm just speculating here, of course. But it's curious, this act of leaving the city to execute werewolves that lived in Constantinople. There are interesting parallels here of what could be the forcible end of the customs of Northern European conscripts, being of pagan origins, of course, those customs, as such, not particularly particularly digestible neither for the Christians of the East nor for the Muslims that came after. There's another very interesting example. In 1573, peasants in the Dole region, located in France, of course, were authorized by the Court of Parliament to hunt werewolves that roamed the area. Another example, I really like this one. In Bedburg, a man named Peter Strood was accused of transforming into a werewolf and attacking and killing numerous victims. A contemporary woodwork depicts Strood's trial. He was chased, tortured, and then had his head cut off and his body burned. We can see the entire process of becoming a werewolf, attacking and killing his victims until he was captured, tried, tortured, mutilated, beaten, and finally he had his head cut off and his body burned. The horrible and gruesome end of a misunderstood shield brother. Let's return to Jean Granier, the boy I mentioned earlier, who confessed to transforming into a wolf and killing several children and was sentenced to live for the rest of his life in a monastery. I don't know which is worse, really, if a child living in the presence of priests or to be brutally executed in adulthood. Well, the death penalty was not imposed in this particular case because the judges considered the child's mental faculties to be insufficiently developed and, out of imbecility, claimed to be a werewolf. Another common sentence was death by burning, as suffered by Gilles Garnier in 1574 and the duo Pierre Bourgault and Michel Verdon in 1521, whom I mentioned earlier. These treatments reflect both the violence caused by werewolves and the desire and the need felt by individuals to curb the actions of lycanthropes. And despite the hunts and killings, werewolves continued to enter territories and terrorize populations. You see, for me, of course, given so many accounts from 16th century France and Germany, we are witnessing nothing less than possibly a witch hunt due to the religious conflicts of the time. Protestantism, having its origin in the 16th century, precisely the 16th century Protestant Reformation, led to a religious conflict between Christians. As I've mentioned several times in other videos before about witchcraft, the history of witchcraft, this is precisely the period with the highest number of executions for witchcraft and sorcery. Whether the people were actually sorcerers, witches, etc. or not, didn't matter at that time. The war between Catholics and Protestants was horrific, with both sides accusing the other of pacts with the devil, heresy, witchcraft, and other things. The goal was the goal was to eliminate opponents to the religion that was intended to be established as the sole administrative force of the religious establishment. I think that in many cases we are only dealing with victims of religious persecution and a few cases of indeed murderers, psychopaths, whose acts serve as an example for one or another religious side to demonstrate the macabre actions committed by one or another side of the conflicting religions at the time. Of course, in the later cinematic world, let's say, starting in 1913 with the short film called The Werewolf, this theme has been prevalent in films focusing heavily on savagery, blood and murder, intense violence, all of which are quite common elements associated with lycanthropy in medieval and modern accounts, as we have seen throughout this video. So I am very curious to see how Robert Eggers approaches this theme in his next video. I would really like it to be a different take than what we are used to. Given that Robert Eggers relies heavily on historical accounts, perhaps his film will be more reminiscent of those bloody and violent tales, but I hope not, right? Old Theus would be a better take, the Livonian Werewolf. In any case, I doubt it will be a bad film. Robert Eggers always manages to surprise me positively. Well, my dear friends, I do hope today's video was useful and I hope you have enjoyed this. Thanks so much for watching, see you on the next video, and as always, thank you for today. Until we meet again, my dear friends.